Oikonomia Network began almost exactly 7 years ago. In March of 2010, we had a couple of meetings with about a half dozen people each, where we all sat together in a room. We were just there for a long period of time, just having open-ended conversation, and we dreamed together about what it would be like to launch something to renew theological education for the challenges of the present time. We knew that it would have to center on whole life discipleship, on claiming all areas of our lives for discipleship to Christ, as opposed to that secular sacred divide. We knew that that would lead us directly into vocation, fruitful work that serves God's people and God's world. We also knew that that would lead us directly into a need for new approaches to wisdom about the social structures that we work within. Wisdom about our cultures, wisdom about our economies, about communities, wisdom about our civilization, wisdom about our world. It's been an exciting 7 years, and God has done a lot in our midst in that time. We've come a long way, but we have a long way to go. The vineyard imagery of Karam Forum speaks to this vision. In Micah 4, it famously says, "They shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid." Don't miss the next part. "For the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken." So this is a vision of flourishing in the vineyard that protects the individual person, preserves that individual from fear of being attacked or victimized, and giving them the freedom to flourish under their vine and fig tree. It's a vision in which the individual person is precious to God, that every individual is precious to God, that there is nobody who is nobody. But for some reason, a little less well known, there's a similar line in Zechariah. Zechariah 3, it says, "In that day, declares the Lord of hosts, every one of you will invite his neighbor to come under his vine and under his fig tree." So you see, in the vineyard, not only is the individual protected and given the freedom to flourish, but people come together in community. They're generous and they're responsible to take care of one another's flourishing. There is, because people are protected and secure, they have the freedom to invite one another into their lives, to enjoy together what God has done for all of them. So it's a vision of flourishing for individuals, but it's also a vision of flourishing for communities, where people come together to share what God has done for them. Now, this is obviously an eschatological vision. It's a vision that will be fulfilled in the future. But as we know, the way we live today has got to point forward to the eschatological vision of flourishing in Christ in the vineyard, individually and together. Now, you've heard a lot about these issues during Karam Forum. You've heard a lot about whole life discipleship, about vocation, fruitful work, about economic wisdom, poverty, the challenges that face us in the contemporary world, and the need for us to develop wisdom about these things, to encourage people in their work, to call people to high ethical standards in their work, to serve the good of others, to take care of their households and their communities. But our time together at Karam Forum would not be complete if I didn't say a word about the fact that we have built the Oikonomia Network by and for schools. That we have built the Oikonomia Network by and for Christian higher educational institutions. And I need to say something about why that is, why we consider theological schools and Christian higher education to be indispensable to this mission in the contemporary world. Now, I'm very supportive of other forms of education. I'm not saying that this is the only way to deliver education. Digital learning has brought education to people who for various reasons aren't able to join us for residential education. But digital learning and other forms of education are made possible largely by the fact that there are institutions that operate as communities of higher learning, which produce the people who are able to carry out digital learning effectively. And it's also important to acknowledge that all people in all walks of life are sources of knowledge. We're not the only people who produce knowledge and insight. Paul Williams said at one of our earlier ON events, he said, if you want a theology of business, people who work in business are going to be leaders in developing it, because they're the people who know both the needs and how to apply theology to that region. It's not that only they are involved, but they will have to have leadership roles. If you want a theology of business, you need the people from that world. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you. And that is not only because the knowledge produced by the eye would be ineffective if it were not put into practice by the action of the hand. It's also the case that the hand is a source of knowledge. Your hand knows things that your eyes do not. And so the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you. The hand is a source of knowledge. So the contribution of higher education is not simply that we educate, because many people educate and many institutions educate. And it's not simply that we produce knowledge, because people in all walks of life have knowledge. I believe that the unique contribution of higher education is that we have an opportunity to draw together knowledge from diverse sources, from many disciplines and from people in all walks of life. And from this diverse set of sources of knowledge, we can integrate things and see how things fit together and seek coherence in that seemingly chaotic stream of information that several of our speakers have spoken about here at Karam Forum. That coherence people are seeking. We, as educators in higher education, are uniquely positioned to draw together different sources of information and seek to bring out coherence and integration. That's why it's so important for our schools to operate as communities of learning, not to be siloed, like Kevin was talking about last night. To share our learning with one another and to interact as a community of learners and teachers. Because integration and coherence can only come from the free exchange of knowledge and insight among people in community. Now, do our schools do that as well as they could? No. That's why we're here. That's why I have job security. Do our institutions have to be structured always and forever the way they're structured today? Well, I sure hope not, because if so, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. But if we're humble enough to learn from each other and from people in all walks of life, if we're humble enough to engage cooperatively with others who are engaged in educational efforts in many contexts, our schools are uniquely positioned to cast a fresh vision for God's people in the coming generation. You know, education doesn't produce instant results. It requires an enormous amount of long, slow, patient, conscientious effort. It requires you to invest yourself in something and trust God that it will produce results. But you know what? The slow things are the important things. The changes that are taking place in our world seem to be moving very fast, but actually they're not. They're actually the long, slow development of changes that have been taking place for centuries. Think about, for example, what Charles Taylor talks about the emergence of the immanent frame, over many centuries, or James Davison Hunter writing about dissolution in advanced modernity, or Peter Berger talking about the disappearance of plausibility structures and the emergence of what he calls epistemic contagion. By the way, if all those names don't mean anything to you, if you are interested in getting into that literature, the place I'd recommend beginning is Peter Berger's book, The Many Altars of Modernity. It's a short book, and it's written to be accessible to those with no background in social science, and I highly recommend it. But the basic accumulated point of all these different lines of inquiry is that over centuries, things like religious freedom and economic and technological development and other factors, most of which are good things in themselves, right? Religious freedom is good in itself. Economic development is good. In many cases, these are things that we need and things that the church has fought and sacrificed to build up. But cumulatively, these things have been slowly dissolving the old social order, the old ways of organizing our lives together. And new ways of organizing our lives together have not yet fully emerged. And that's why the seemingly rapid, seemingly incomprehensible changes are happening all around us. There's been a disappearance of shared givens, things that are taken for granted, beliefs about the world, beliefs about nature, beliefs about the cosmos, the meaning of it all. It's not that people don't have moral and religious beliefs, they certainly do. But now, those beliefs are a matter of individual choice. You can be raised Christian and choose to become atheist. You can be raised atheist and choose to become Christian. And the fact that you can choose makes these beliefs unstable and ambiguous as sources of moral and religious commitment. It becomes harder for people to build their lives around this as if they knew it were true, when in the back of their minds they know that they could choose to live a different way. And nobody knows yet how to deal with a world in which people have this choice, this epistemic contagion, as Berger calls it. The main result is social orders are moving more and more towards a morally thin basis, which I like to call technocracy. At the panel yesterday afternoon, this word was mentioned, and someone said we don't use it very much anymore, but it's still very much a prominent reality. This is an ethical least common denominator, where you build society around the lowest level of moral and ethical commitment that you can get everyone to agree to. And then within that morally thin, morally anemic framework, what ends up happening is the pursuit of wealth and comfort and luxury becomes the end, the primary end that social order teaches people to live their lives toward, because it doesn't have much else to affirm in the public square. We see this kind of morally thin, technocratic social order on both sides of the political aisle, the worship of making money on both sides of the political aisle. I was really struck this afternoon. Amy Sherman read that definition of real freedom from John Stuart Mill, right? The only freedom that's worthy of the name is the freedom to pursue your own good. And then she shouted out to me from the stage, she said, "Greg, does that make him a libertarian?" The reason I shook my head was actually John Stuart Mill was a socialist. But it was a reasonable question on Amy's part. And I was planning to say this in the talk even before Amy asked me this question, but libertarianism and socialism are really just two sides of the same materialistic coin. You know why? Because they both operate on this idea that the only freedom that really counts is the freedom to pursue your own good. Or if you don't believe that, I'll drill it down even further for you. For both an extreme individualistic view and an extreme collectivist view, the only common good that people share together is the desire to get wealthy. The only common good is making money. Everything else is a matter of your individual idea of what's good. The social order is built on the assumption that the only thing everyone agrees is good is to make money. This empty, technocratic pursuit of wealth is unsustainable. It's unsustainable because the moral justifications that are offered for the institutions of this order are insufficient. And in their hearts, everyone knows it. I'll give you one example. Recently, the Ohio Department of Public Health released the following piece of information. During a recent 3-month period, 11% of the entire population of their state had a doctor's prescription for opioid medication. 11% of every man, woman, and child in the state. That's on top of however many people are using it without a prescription, illicitly. The brave new world of Aldous Huxley is coming at us, and it's coming at us fast. This system, this technocratic society, it wants to be both radically individualist and radically collectivist. It wants to be individualist in the sense that it wants everyone to decide for themselves what the meaning of life is, right? You get to make up for yourself the meaning of your life, the purpose of your life, and even the fundamental facts about your life. And yet, while it strives for this individualism, it also, at the same time, paradoxically, becomes very collectivist. Because greed and pride and envy and sloth will always lead people into tyrannical systems of social control. Because it's always easier to let somebody else be in charge and be responsible. And between the radical individualism and the radical collectivism, you can't be safe under your vine and fig tree or invite your neighbor to come enjoy your vine and fig tree with you. So in response to this moral emptiness, we're seeing the rise of various forms of tribalism, various movements that seek to escape from moral emptiness by investing themselves into tribalistic identities, nationalism, ethnic tribalism, religious tribalism, even sexual tribalism, and on and on. You know, our friend Charlie Self likes to say, people turn to extreme ideologies when they lose hope that their culture has answers to the problems that face it. And the emptiness of our technocratic, wealth-worshipping social order that's emerging is causing people to lose hope, and so they're turning to extreme ideologies. Now, when I talk about tribalism and the danger of tribalism, I'm not talking about any group membership or group loyalty being bad, right? Being patriotic or loving your group, that's just loving your neighbor, right? Kahn was talking about how embracing his Greek heritage and embracing his Anglo heritage meant that he had something to contribute to people. And the fact that he had two heritages meant he could contribute more to both. So it's not that there's anything inherently wrong with being part of a group. When I'm talking about tribalism, what I mean is people who advance the good of their group at the expense of other groups. Right? It runs on resentment. It runs on grievances against wrongs that have been done by other people. They've taken what's ours and they've wronged us, so we have to get back at them and take back what's ours. You know, it's amazing how radical Islam and the French National Front, who are fighting each other so fiercely, seem to say exactly the same things about each other. They sound very similar. P.J. Hill, I was talking with P.J. Hill about this. He made the comment, with movements like this, it's always about what other people are doing. They've done this to us. They've done that to us. They're invading. They took our stuff. It's always reactive. It's always pushing agency to the other party. It's never about who we are and what good things define us and what are the good things that we aspire to. You can't build a positive identity around any of that. These tribalisms are never really authentic continuations of historic traditions or identities. Tribalism is a modern construct. It's a response to technocracy. I don't know if you've seen John Inazu's book, Confident Pluralism. I think that's the key difference. The key difference between a virtuous patriotism or loyalty to your group and a poisonous tribalism is a confidence that the peoples of the world can live together in peace. If you're confident that your group can live together in peace with other groups, that's a good sign that your membership in that group is not poisonous and resentment-driven. Now, as I say all this, I don't want to sound too never-before-in-history-ish, right? The basic problem of living as faithful disciples in a fallen world is pretty much the same always and everywhere, right? The basic problem of bringing the holy love of God into an unholy world is pretty much standard issue, right, for all times and places. But there are unique circumstances in every generation, and it's our job to meet the particular challenge of our particular moment. And here's the biggest challenge of our moment. Most Christian believers are conforming to this pattern of technocratic worship of making money or tribalistic, resentful identity. Most of the people in our churches are conforming to this morally empty pursuit of wealth, comfort, and luxury, or signing up for various kinds of nationalist movements or ethnic resentment, or even a sort of fundamentalist Christian tribalism in which the Christian community itself becomes the tribalistic identity asserted against our neighbors. I am the vine. You are the branches. You can do nothing without me. The rise of technocracy and tribalism and the long, slow deconstruction of our social structures that we see under both of them are the proof that we can do nothing without Jesus. I was stunned when Lisa Slayton said yesterday, it's not that it was news to me, I knew it, but I was stunned when she reminded us of it, that we have too many pastors who are not disciples of Jesus. Never mind congregants. That's a wake-up call. We need a gospel alternative to these choices. As Trevin Wax says, we need to find our gospel bearings, right? Get our gospel bearings. Now, there will be limits to what we can do. We can't disciple people if they choose not to follow Jesus. So there will always, in the present age, there'll always be limits. But we need to understand, what would a gospel alternative to technocracy and tribalism look like? We need that just for our own walk with Jesus. If we and our people are going to walk with Jesus, we need to know what that looks like. And once we figure out what it looks like, how could we not offer that to our neighbors and our communities as an alternative? We can't keep letting the world form our people for us. We have to develop an alternative to offer to our people and then to the world. Darrow Miller of the Disciple Nations Alliance, which is one of our sponsors here at Karam Forum, he says this: if the church does not disciple the nations will disciple the church. If the church does not disciple the nations, make disciples of, from, in all nations, then the nations will disciple the church. The holy love of God does not withdraw from the unholiness of the unholy world. The holy love of God rushes into the unholiness of the unholy world in order to offer to an unholy world the only thing that can cleanse it from its unholiness, which is the holy love of God in Jesus. And that doesn't just mean verbal proclamation of the gospel. If God's people demonstrate through their character and through their institutions, if God's people demonstrate that what we really care about is wealth and comfort, or that what we really care about is pride and power, then verbal proclamation of the gospel is going to ring pretty hollow. It is God's people, not the whole world. It is God's people who are depicted in the Bible as God's vineyard. God is the vine dresser, and God's people are his vineyard. But whom is that vineyard bearing fruit for? The gospel is not just for the life of people who are already inside our churches. The gospel is for the life of the whole world. Stephen Grable is right. The church is the body of Christ given as a gift for the life of the world. where are we going to find a vision that big for our time? Where are we going to find people who have the humility to learn what they need to learn from Christians in every walk of life? Where are we going to find people who will partner with others in casting that vision for all to see? To form people as disciples of Jesus, we need families, we need local churches, we need primary and secondary schools, parachurch organizations, denominations, many, many other things. And I want to affirm the importance of all those institutions and the people who work in them. But who has the best opportunity right now to cast a fresh vision in cooperation with all these institutions? Well, in past generations, when the church needed a fresh vision, where did it find it? Think about this. Gregory the Great, not me, Gregory the Great discovered that the doctrine of the incarnation could bring joy into the desert wasteland of his bureaucratic and paperwork administrivia responsibilities as the head of a large multinational institution. Martin Luther discovered that the doctrine of justification by faith could illuminate the beauty and the glory and the honor of changing a dirty diaper. And more recently, Martin Luther King discovered that when fists and knives and guns and bombs were of no avail, the doctrine that God is love in the Trinity could destroy injustice and bring freedom and recognition of dignity to millions of people. Now, what did these people have in common? A great deal, no doubt. They're following God and Jesus, yes, and many other things we could name. But one thing they have in common is that before they became public reformers, they were incubated in institutions that were communities of learning. Our communities of learning today are beginning to undertake, continuing to undertake, incubating the renewal and the reform that we need. At one of our ON events, Bob Cooley made the point, 80% of the revenue of theological schools comes directly from the activity of the faculty. The faculty, he said, have as much right to speak to the mission of the institution as administrative leadership. Paul Williams, in one of our events, talked about how the model of theological education we have inherited was created for a situation where education had to be scholastic and clerical, as he put it. And we need a new model that is ecclesial and missional. And I think Kevin was saying something very similar with much more detail and depth last night. That Schleiermacher, the great sort of liberal reformer, created the disciplinary structure that we operate out of today. It's a 19th century model we continue to use. Dan Aylshire, the head of the Association of Theological Schools, at one of our events, he said that in theological schools that are changing to meet the needs of the new generation, in addition to knowledge, the mission is now also formation. One of our partner schools I went to, and they told me, we have inherited a curriculum that assumes that people are disciples of Jesus before they come to us. And we need to change the curriculum for a situation where that is no longer true. I'll connect that now back to something else that Dan said. Dan said, it is an enormous challenge that we don't yet know how to handle. How do we go from measuring whether our students know something to measuring whether they have become something and holding ourselves accountable to that as a standard of success? You see, God is the vine dresser who tends the vineyard. But we also participate in his vine dressing. It's God who tends the vines, but he does that in part by raising up people who can tend the vines of the vineyard, his people. The gospel alternative to technocracy and tribalism begins with trusting in God for the future, for our faith, for our future, and for our flourishing. Not trusting the illusory power of money, not trusting the illusory power of politics and pride, but trusting that God will care for his people. In 2 Kings 19, at a time of extreme danger for God's people, God calls upon his people to trust him, to trust that he will rescue them. He doesn't tell them how he's going to rescue them, so they have to trust that he will do it. And as a sign of their trust, he tells them, leave your fields and your vineyards fallow for a season. Now that's an enormous sign of trust, because if you don't plant, what are you going to eat next year? But he said, leave your fields and vineyards fallow for a year as a sign of your trust that I am your sustenance. And the text says this, and the surviving remnant of the house of Judah shall again take root downward and bear fruit upward. And if we trust in these troubled times that God will preserve his people, then the surviving remnant of God's people will again take root downward and bear fruit upward. Take root in Christ and bear fruit for Christ's people and Christ's world. Now we have to be nimble. We don't know in advance what changes may be needed. Virtually every institution represented in this room either was founded very recently, historically speaking, or has been refounded or reinvented relatively recently, historically speaking. You know, I found out recently for the first time, I knew that Trinity had been through a number of different incarnations, but one thing I didn't know, you know, it began as a Swedish language Bible institute. At one point, because of reduced immigration from Swedish-speaking sources, they were unable to keep Trinity going. It was then called the Swedish Bible Institute. They were unable to keep it going as an independent school. So for 15 years, from 1915 to 1930, this school was the Swedish language arm of Moody Bible Institute. So if you're wondering why Sajan Matthews and Julius Wong Sing and Chris Brooks have been walking around the halls here and all of our other friends from Moody just nodding their heads contentedly and feeling really proud, it's because they feel so good that their little spin-off school has done so well on its own. One more thing I'd like to say about the vineyard. It takes years of work to get a vineyard going. You plant the seeds, and it takes years before you've really got a flourishing vineyard that's producing a lot of fruit. But it only takes one season of neglect to destroy it forever. Never underestimate the precious value of what and the fragility of what your schools are stewarding for God's people and God's world. The insight and the knowledge and the potential to find coherence in this chaotic world, they subsist, among other places, they subsist in the minds and in the relationships of the people in your communities of learning. People who teach together and learn together. If the church loses its educational vineyards, that would be a catastrophe. That's why I have given my career to our schools. That's why we have built our network so that we all can strengthen each other. Tom Nelson recently shared with me a proverb. It goes like this. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Brothers and sisters, the struggle to reform and renew theological and other education for the coming generation is going to be a long road. To walk it, we will need God more than anything. And praise God, God has given himself to us. But God has also given us something else. God has given us to each other. And we're going to need each other. It's an honor, it's a privilege, and it's a whole lot of fun to be walking on this road with you. Thank you.